In 2014, on an 800-year-old estate in County Meath, Ireland, a young baron made a decision that confused everyone who knew him. He owned 750 acres of some of the most fertile soil on the island, land that had fed cattle, sheep, and game for 6 unbroken centuries. Land his family had worked, fenced, grazed, and harvested since the time of the Norman kings, and on one quiet morning he walked out to the gate, looked across his fields, and decided to do nothing. Not plant, not restore, not rewild in the conventional sense, just stop. He removed the livestock, he cancelled the hunting leases, he let the grass grow past his knees, and kept walking back to his castle, while every neighboring farmer, every local hunter, and nearly every conservation expert in the country predicted he had just destroyed one of Ireland's finest working estates. The technology that reversed 800 years of land management was not a drone. It was not a genetically engineered seed. It was not a government program worth millions of euros. It was a gate, a closed gate. And what happened on the other side of it over the next 10 years is one of the stranger ecological stories in modern European science. But to understand why closing a gate on fertile Irish farmland could matter at all, you first have to understand what Ireland actually is beneath its famous green surface. 6,000 years ago, 80% of Ireland was forest. Oak, ash, hazel, alder, Scots pine, a canopy so continuous and so dense that a red squirrel could travel from the east coast to the west coast without once touching the ground. The island was not green in the way a farmer means green. It was green in the way a forest is green, dark, deep, and alive in layers. That world is gone, and it did not disappear in a single event. It dissolved across thousands of years of small decisions made by people who needed fuel, pasture, and timber more than they needed shade. The first clearances were made by Mesolithic hunters. Medieval livestock replaced the wild grazers that had once moved through the woodland without destroying it. The British Royal Navy harvested Irish oak by the shipload in the 1600s, though the historians who have studied the period most carefully note that by the 1700s, Irish landowners themselves were clearing as much timber as the colonial navy, because fuel and pasture paid better than standing trees. Mobile sawmills arrived in the 1800s and finished the rest. By 1925, forest cover on the island of Ireland had fallen to 1%, 1 from 80. What replaced it was grass. Today, 70% of Ireland is agricultural land. 90% of that agricultural land is grass. The country holds 7 million cattle for a human population of just over 5 million people. What looks from the air like Ireland's famous soft green beauty is, in ecological terms, a closely managed protein factory. Most of the species that lived inside that original forest, dozens of moths, beetles, fungi, ground-nesting birds, went quietly extinct while almost nobody was recording the losses. The great spotted woodpecker, a bird native to the Irish woodland, disappeared from the island entirely sometime in the 1700s or 1800s. Not hunted, not poisoned, simply starved of the old-growth habitat it needed to survive. By the time it was gone, the forest it depended on had already been gone for generations. This was the country that Randall Plunkett, 21st Baron of Dunsany, inherited in 2011 at the age of 28. He was not a likely candidate for what came next. Born in New York, educated abroad, he had spent most of his 20s trying to get horror films made, rather than learning to manage a Norman castle. His Jack Russell Terriers were named Tiny, Lumpy, Cow, and Beavis and Butthead. His wardrobe leaned toward death metal. He was, by any visible measure, the least traditionally aristocratic Irish baron in living memory. His 19th-century ancestor, Sir Horace Plunkett, had helped invent modern Irish agriculture under the slogan, "Better farming, better business, better living." The Plunketts had for centuries been on the productive edge of Irish land use, which is what made what Randall did in 2014 so jarring to everyone who knew the family name. That year, he went vegan, read enough climate science to become genuinely alarmed, and encountered a word he had not heard before: rewilding. His insight was not scientific, it was closer to literary. The land at Dunsany, he decided, was not dead. It was preserved, buried under 800 years of grazing pressure, but still there, waiting. The problem, as he came to see it, was not the land. The problem was what was eating the land. For 800 years, Dunsany had been home to a very large, very persistent lawnmower. In 2014, Randall Plunkett opened the gate and let the lawnmower out. What followed was not a triumph. Not immediately. The bank account began to bleed the moment the cattle left. The income from livestock, from sheep, from the hunting leases that local clubs had used for generations, all of it gone at once, with no state grant to replace any of it. The hunters who had walked those fields for free did not leave quietly. Plunkett has spoken publicly about being threatened, about men arriving in his fields holding rifles, about the sustained social pressure of being seen by his community as someone carelessly destroying good farmland for an idea he had read in a book. He calls that period, without drama, going to war. By the third year, standing inside the perimeter of what he had designated as his rewilding zone, it was difficult to defend his decision. The fields looked like neglected farmland. Rank grass, some scrub beginning at the edges, nothing that resembled a forest in any direction. The local consensus had settled into something close to contempt. Conservation experts, the ones who had bothered to look, predicted the project would need 100 years before it showed anything measurable. He kept the gate closed for one more year. And that was the year the land began to write back. What happened inside that perimeter is not magic. It is a documented ecological mechanism that operates the same way across temperate climates from Britain to Belarus, and it begins, not with a tree, but with a thorny shrub. When grazing pressure is removed from land that still holds a viable seed bank, the sequence that follows moves in a predictable order. First, the grass grows tall, and within that tall grass, wildflowers appear, species that had been present in the soil for decades, waiting for the chance to reach the light. Then the birds arrive, thrushes and blackbirds eating berries from hedgerows, dropping seeds across the field as they move. Bramble comes first, dense, thorny, impenetrable from ground level. Blackthorn follows. Hawthorn fills the gaps between them. Most people see bramble and register it as a weed. Ecologists see it as infrastructure. A jay drops an acorn into the center of a bramble thicket. The acorn germinates. A deer that wants to eat the resulting seedling now has to push through a wall of inch-long thorns to reach a single leaf. The deer turns around. The oak seedling survives its first winter, then its second, then its 10th. By the time the oak is too tall for any deer to browse, the bramble that protected it begins to die back in the canopy shade. The forest finishes itself. This process has a name in peer-reviewed ecology literature. It is called the Thorny Island effect. It drives passive rewilding schemes across lowland Europe, from the County Estate in Sussex to large-scale projects in Poland and Romania. It requires no planting, no grant application, no site preparation. It requires only one thing, the removal of whatever was preventing it from happening. At Dunsany, what had been preventing it for 800 years was a cow. Plunkett never planted a tree on the rewilded acreage. Not one. What grew at Dunsany grew because the conditions that had suppressed it were lifted. The seed bank under the pasture, cold, acid-preserved Irish soil that can hold organic material intact for centuries, still contained viable native seed. The birds overhead were still moving through, still carrying fresh seed every season. The mycelium network under the grass, the fungal web that connects and sustains woodland root systems, had never fully died. It had simply been waiting for permission to expand. The forest had not vanished. It had been underneath the lawn the entire time. By year 5, the results were measurable enough to attract outside verification. Birdwatch Ireland and the European Rewilding Network began conducting formal surveys on the rewilded ground. What they found was not the slow drift the skeptics had predicted. It was a cascade. Bird species counts on the rewilded acreage rose by 35%. Insect populations, pollinators, and ground invertebrates doubled within 5 years of the livestock being removed. Camera traps placed around the perimeter began recording species that had not been documented on the estate in living memory: stoats, hedgehogs, and then, unmistakably, pine martens. Pine martens matter to ecologists for a reason that seems almost too neat to be real. They eat gray squirrels. The North American gray squirrel, introduced to Britain and Ireland in the 19th century, had been displacing the native red squirrel from its range for over 100 years. Where pine martens establish themselves, gray squirrel populations collapse. Where gray squirrel populations collapse, red squirrels return. The system, once it reached sufficient complexity, had begun to regulate itself without any human instruction. Then, otters appeared in the River Skane, which runs along the estate boundary. Plunkett has said an otter had not been seen on the estate in his entire lifetime. The project was working. The question was how far it would go. The answer arrived in the form of a bird. The great spotted woodpecker had been absent from Ireland for somewhere between 2 and 3 centuries. Not from one county, from the entire island. The deforestation of the 1700s and 1800s had not driven it away. It had simply removed every mature tree the bird needed to survive, and the woodpecker, having no forest left to live in, had disappeared without anyone marking the occasion. The species began recolonizing from Britain in the early 2000s. The first confirmed modern breeding pair on the island was recorded in County Down in 2006, and the population had been spreading slowly westward ever since. But County Meath, sitting in the heart of Ireland's most intensively farmed landscape, had no record of the bird. Not in the 20th century. Not in the 19th. Not, as far as the historical record reached, since at least the 1700s. In the woods at Dunsany, a forest that had not existed a decade earlier, Niall Hatch of Birdwatch Ireland documented the first confirmed great spotted woodpecker ever recorded in the entire history of County Meath. 3 centuries of absence ended in one woodland that had grown because someone stopped mowing it. Plunkett has said in interviews that since 2014 he has averaged 1 new species return per year. 1 new arrival every 12 months, for over a decade, on land that his neighbors had called ruined. The numbers that Birdwatch Ireland and the European Rewilding Network formally attached to the project by its 10th year are worth reading in sequence. 750 acres removed from livestock and hunting. Bird species count up 35%. Pollinator counts doubled within 5 years. Corncrake, red kite, snipe, peregrine falcon, and barn owl all confirmed as returned without reintroduction. Pine martens and otters re-established. The first breeding record of great spotted woodpecker in County Meath, ever. The first Irish project admitted to the European Rewilding Network. This is, by any reasonable standard, an extraordinary ecological result. But the honest version of the story requires 2 caveats, and the channel that covers these stories owes them to you directly. The first is financial. Without the 950 remaining acres of the estate still in tillage and leased to tenant farmers, without the castle operating as a commercial film location, without Plunkett's own post-production company generating independent income, the project would have collapsed in its 3rd year, exactly as the skeptics predicted. The biology underneath the Dunsany experiment is not aristocratic. It scales. The European Rewilding Network catalogues dozens of successful passive rewilding projects under 50 acres across the continent using the same method. What does not easily scale is the financial cushion that lets a landowner survive 3 years of negative returns before the land begins to demonstrate its own case. That problem is real, and anyone who tells you it isn't is selling something. The second caveat is time. A native Irish oak grows roughly 10 meters in its first 10 years. Visitors to Dunsany today can hear the woodpecker. They can stand inside a young woodland and genuinely feel what the project has already achieved. What they are standing in is, in ecological terms, the opening paragraph of a very long book. Real maturity for a native Irish oak, the kind of tree that supports more than 300 associated species, the kind of tree that functions as a complete ecosystem rather than a promising seedling, takes approximately 100 years. The forest at Dunsany will not reach that maturity until somewhere around the year 2114. The experiment Plunkett began will be finished by someone who has not yet been born, which raises the question the project has never been able to fully answer. Rewilding is not protected by statute in Ireland. Plunkett has a daughter, a stepdaughter, and a brother who is heir presumptive. Whoever inherits Dunsany next will receive a half-built ecosystem and the full legal freedom to manage it however they choose. The cattle could come back. The hunting leases could come back. The lawnmowers could come back. The forest lives or dies on whether the next caretaker keeps the boundary closed. The experiment is, in that sense, an inheritance argument running slowly in oak. What Dunsany demonstrates, what it demonstrates regardless of its scale or its aristocratic circumstances, is a principle. Almost every restoration project on the planet begins by asking what to add. Dunsany began by asking what to remove. Livestock, hunting pressure, mowing. Take those three pressures off land that still holds ecological memory, and 800 years of buried forest begins to unbury itself. The soil remembered, the seed bank remembered, the birds overhead had never stopped moving through, the mycelium had never fully died. What looked from the road like ruined farmland was, underneath the surface, a forest that had been waiting for permission. The Baron's contribution to that process was not scientific, it was not financial, it was not even particularly difficult, once he had made up his mind. His contribution was a decision. He closed a gate, walked back to his castle, and let the woodpecker come home on its own. If that principle interests you, the idea that subtraction can sometimes do what addition never could, there are other stories built on the same logic. A valley in the American Southwest, brought back from bare desert by a single family of beavers who walked in uninvited. Coastlines stabilized against erosion by a shellfish that every commercial fishery had spent a century overfishing into near extinction. Roadsides across northern Europe turned into pollinator corridors by the single act of stopping the lawnmower on a highway verge. The engineering behind each one is just removal.